"Look, Pops, it's leftovers. Okay? What do you expect? We were busy tonight. Just be grateful." Those sharp, dismissive words cut through the fluorescent hum of the diner like a knife, landing squarely on the shoulders of the old man sitting alone at the counter. He didn't flinch, didn't argue. He just nodded, a slow, weary dip of his head, accepting the plastic container shoved across the worn laminate surface. He took it gently, careful not to spill whatever meager contents sloshed inside, his gnarled fingers trembling slightly. This wasn't a meal. It was an insult, a discarded scrap. The waitress who delivered it barely spared him a glance, her attention already snatched away by the boisterous laughter from a nearby booth. But the true indignity? He'd seen her scrape the contents into the container. Scrape them from a bin near the kitchen door, a bin meant for scraps, for garbage. And she had given it to him, Elias Vance, as his dinner. If you believe every person, regardless of appearance or circumstance, deserves respect, type respect in the comments right now. Elias Vance was a man who carried the weight of years not just on his shoulders, but in the very lines etched into his face, the slow, deliberate way he moved, the faded blue of his eyes that seemed to have seen too much. His clothes were clean but worn, patched in places, practical and unassuming. He wasn't homeless, not technically. He had a small, cramped room above a garage on the edge of town, paid for by the dwindling remains of a modest pension that stretched thinner with every passing month. He didn't complain. Complaining wasn't in his nature. He was a man of quiet endurance, honed by decades of living a life most people only saw in movies or history books, a life he rarely spoke of. He had arrived in this town a few years ago, a stranger seeking only peace and anonymity, finding solace in the predictable rhythm of its days and the quiet corners where an old man could sit and watch the world go by. The diner, the daily grind, had become his ritual. A cup of coffee in the morning, maybe a cheap breakfast special if he could afford it. Dinner was less frequent, often just black coffee to fill the emptiness. He preferred the counter, less conspicuous, a vantage point from which he could observe the townspeople, their hurried lives, their small joys, their casual cruelties. He noticed everything, said little. His silence was often mistaken for simple-mindedness or senility by the younger generation, like the waitress, Sarah. Sarah was young, maybe early 20s, full of the impatience and casual entitlement that often comes with youth. She had worked at the daily grind for about a year. To her, Elias was just another diner regular, one of the quiet, elderly fixtures who took up space and rarely ordered much. She saw his worn clothes, his slow movements, his quiet demeanor, and drew her conclusions. He was poor, probably lonely, maybe a little senile. Someone to be tolerated, but certainly not someone who commanded respect or attention. He was the kind of customer you served quickly, hoping they wouldn't linger, wouldn't cause a fuss. Tonight had been particularly busy. The dinner rush had been relentless, the kitchen overwhelmed, the staff frayed. When Elias had quietly asked if there might be any leftovers he could purchase cheaply, a practice the previous manager had sometimes allowed, Sarah had been annoyed. Leftovers? Who asks for leftovers? She had glanced at the bin near the kitchen, the one where slightly less than perfect portions or uneaten side dishes from buffet-style offerings sometimes ended up before being properly discarded. A nasty idea sparked. It would be quick, easy, and get him out of her hair. It wasn't real garbage, just pre-garbage. Scraps. Good enough for him, right? She hadn't expected him to actually see her scoop it out. And she certainly hadn't expected him to accept it without a word, without even a flicker of visible offense. Just that quiet, heartbreaking nod. The plastic container sat on the counter between them, a symbol of her contempt and his quiet suffering. A few other patrons glanced over, noticing the exchange, the harsh tone in Sarah's voice. A couple in a booth nearby exchanged disapproving looks, but didn't speak up. Mr. Henderson, the manager, was in his office doing paperwork, oblivious. The rhythm of the diner, the clatter of plates, the sizzle from the grill, the murmur of conversation, continued around this small, isolated moment of cruelty. Elias carefully picked up the container. It was still warm. He could smell a mix of things, gravy, some overcooked vegetables, maybe a piece of dried-out chicken. It smelled like pity, like dismissal. He didn't open it. He simply held it for a moment, his gaze distant, as if looking at something far away. Then, with the same quiet dignity he possessed in all things, he stood up. He left a single crumpled dollar bill on the counter, enough for the coffee he hadn't ordered. A small act of refusing to be a complete recipient of charity, even this twisted form of it. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, directed perhaps not at Sarah, but at some unseen presence, some internal code. He turned and shuffled slowly towards the door, the container held loosely in his hand. Sarah watched him go, a smirk playing on her lips. "Yeah, whatever, Pops," she muttered under her breath, already wiping down the counter. The couple in the booth watched Elias leave, their expressions a mix of pity and awkwardness. They still didn't say anything. Elias walked out into the cool evening air, the plastic container feeling heavy, not with food, but with the weight of being invisible, of being judged and found wanting based solely on the worn fabric of his coat and the slowness of his gait. He didn't take the food home. As he passed a public trash receptacle a block away, he paused, looked around to ensure no one was watching, and gently placed the container inside. He couldn't bring himself to eat it. He just couldn't. He walked the rest of the way to his small room, the gnawing emptiness in his stomach less painful than the ache in his chest. He spent the evening as he often did, sitting in the dark, looking out his window at the few distant lights of the town. His thoughts drifting back through the decades, to times when he was seen, when he mattered, when his name was spoken with respect, even reverence. He didn't dwell on the disrespect he'd faced. He was used to it. The world changed. People forgot. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, the weight of being forgotten felt heavier than usual. He went to bed hungry, but his soul felt cleaner than if he had consumed the scraps of pity he'd been offered. The next morning arrived like any other. Elias woke with the first hint of dawn, performed his simple morning routine, and prepared himself for the day. Habit and the faint hope of a warm drink drew him back towards the daily grind. He arrived just as Mr. Henderson was unlocking the front door, Sarah already inside setting up tables, nursing a soda, looking bored. Elias nodded a polite greeting to Mr. Henderson, who gave him a brief, indifferent nod in return before disappearing into his office. Sarah saw him come in and rolled her eyes, turning her back to finish setting up a table, deliberately ignoring him. Elias walked to his usual spot at the counter and sat down. The diner was quiet, the morning rush not yet begun. The air was filled with the scent of brewing coffee and frying bacon, a smell that usually offered comfort, but today felt like a cruel tease. He sat silently, waiting. Sarah finally sauntered over, a notepad in hand, not making eye contact. "Just coffee, right?" she asked, her tone flat, already turning towards the coffee maker. Elias's stomach clenched slightly, remembering last night. He considered just leaving, but the cold outside was biting, and the simple warmth of the diner was hard to abandon. "Yes, please," he replied softly. She poured the coffee, placed the mug on the counter with a slight clatter, and walked away without a word. He wrapped his hands around the warm mug, feeling the heat seep into his old bones. He watched as a few early morning regulars started to drift in, taking their usual seats. Then, the front door swung open again, but this time, it didn't admit a single customer. A wave of silence washed over the diner as the first figure stepped inside, followed immediately by another, and then more. Dressed in crisp, unmistakable marine dress blues, they filled the doorway, their polished shoes gleaming, their bearing ramrod straight. One, clearly an officer judging by his rank, stood at the front. Behind him, flanking him, stood 24 other Marines, forming a silent, imposing presence that blocked out the morning light. They weren't just any Marines. They were a formation disciplined and focused. They didn't move, didn't speak, their eyes scanning the room until they landed on the figure sitting quietly at the counter, hands around a coffee mug. Elias looked up, his expression initially one of surprise. Then a slow recognition dawned in his faded blue eyes. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through his hands holding the mug. Mr. Henderson emerged from his office, a look of bewildered annoyance on his face. "Can I help you, gentlemen? We're not quite open for," he started, his voice trailing off as the officer at the front took a step forward, his gaze fixed on Elias. Sarah had frozen mid-stride, a coffee pot in her hand, her mouth slightly agape. The other patrons, those who had just arrived, sat in stunned silence. The officer, a man with silver at his temples and a face weathered by command, walked deliberately towards the counter. His footsteps echoed slightly in the sudden stillness of the diner. He stopped directly in front of Elias. The 24 Marines behind him remained motionless, a wall of silent, watchful strength. The officer's gaze softened slightly as he looked at the old man at the counter, a look of deep respect, almost reverence, in his eyes. "Staff Sergeant Vance?" the officer asked, his voice clear and resonant, cutting through the silence. Elias, still holding the mug, finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Colonel Mitchell?" he acknowledged, a hint of warmth entering his eyes.
Colonel Mitchell.
The name, the rank, the immediate recognition sent a ripple of confusion and shock through the few people present who were paying attention. Sarah paled visibly. Mr. Henderson blinked rapidly, trying to process the scene. Colonel Mitchell didn't hesitate. He turned slightly, addressing the stunned room, his voice now louder, carrying authority that silenced even the ambient hum of the diner. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his posture impeccable. "My name is Colonel Robert Mitchell. These men are Marines under my command. We are here this morning for a very specific and very important reason." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the faces, lingering for a moment on Sarah and Mr. Henderson before returning to Elias. "We received word last night from a concerned citizen who witnessed a regrettable incident in this establishment. An incident involving the treatment of a man who represents the absolute finest of what it means to be a Marine, and indeed, an American." He turned back to Elias, his expression hardening slightly, a flicker of something akin to fierce protective loyalty in his eyes. "Staff Sergeant Elias Vance," Colonel Mitchell announced, his voice ringing with pride and conviction. "Served this nation for 30 years in the United States Marine Corps. He served through 3 wars. He was on the ground in Vietnam, the sands of the Middle East, and the mountains of Afghanistan. He carried his fellow Marines to safety under enemy fire more times than can be counted." As Colonel Mitchell spoke, the quiet dignity Elias possessed suddenly took on a new dimension. The worn clothes, the slow gait, the silence, they weren't signs of weakness or insignificance, but the marks of a life lived fully, sacrificed willingly. Sarah clasped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror and disbelief. Mr. Henderson looked like he might faint. The few early customers were riveted, their earlier indifference evaporating, replaced by awe and shame. Colonel Mitchell continued, his voice a powerful tribute. "Staff Sergeant Vance earned 2 silver stars for gallantry in action, 3 bronze stars for valor, for Purple Hearts for wounds sustained defending the lives of others. He was offered promotions, officer commissions, accolades, and he turned them down time and again, choosing instead to remain a staff sergeant, serving shoulder to shoulder with the young men he mentored, led, and protected." He gestured towards the Marines behind him. "Every single Marine standing here today knows the name Elias Vance. They know his legend. They know the sacrifices he made. Many of their fathers or even grandfathers served under him, learned from him, owed him their lives." He paused, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. The silence in the diner was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of morning traffic outside. "Last night," Colonel Mitchell said, his voice lowering slightly but losing none of its intensity, "Staff Sergeant Vance was treated with utter contempt and disrespect in this establishment. He was given discarded food, scraped from a bin, while the people who benefited from the safety and freedom his decades of sacrifice provided looked on, or worse, were complicit." His gaze locked onto Sarah, then shifted to Mr. Henderson. "Is that correct, miss?" Sarah could only nod, tears welling in her eyes, her face pale. "And Mr. Henderson, you are the manager?" Mr. Henderson managed a weak, trembling, "Yes, sir." Colonel Mitchell's voice became steely. "Staff Sergeant Vance is not just an old man looking for scraps. He is a hero. He is a legend. He is a living testament to courage, duty, and sacrifice. He is a figure who deserves our utmost respect, our deepest gratitude, and our unwavering support." He turned back to Elias, and his tone shifted once more, filled with profound respect. "Staff Sergeant Vance, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps and a grateful nation, we are here to apologize for the way you were treated. We are here to ensure that such disrespect is never shown to you, or any veteran, again." He then turned to the Marines behind him. "Marines," he commanded. In perfect unison, all 24 Marines snapped to attention, their movements precise and powerful. "Present arms." Every Marine raised their right hand in a sharp, unified salute, their eyes fixed on the quiet figure at the counter. Colonel Mitchell himself executed a flawless salute, his gaze meeting Elias's. Elias, still sitting, slowly raised his own hand, his movements slower, less crisp than theirs, but filled with a lifetime of ingrained discipline and mutual respect. He returned their salute, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that transcended age, rank, and circumstance. Tears were streaming down Sarah's face. Mr. Henderson stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and dawning horror. The other customers watched, some with tears in their own eyes, witnessing a moment of profound, unexpected honor unfold before them. Colonel Mitchell held the salute for a long moment, the silent tableau speaking volumes. Then, with a final, respectful nod to Elias, he lowered his hand. The Marines followed suit, their movements just as precise in lowering their arms as they had been in raising them. Colonel Mitchell turned back to Mr. Henderson and Sarah, his expression stern. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice low and firm, "I trust you understand the gravity of what occurred here last night. I expect you to take appropriate action regarding the employee responsible for this egregious act of disrespect." Mr. Henderson, finding his voice, stammered, "Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir." "Sarah, go home. You're fired. Get out." Sarah let out a small sob and stumbled towards the back exit, her face buried in her hands. "As for Staff Sergeant Vance," Colonel Mitchell continued, his voice softening slightly as he looked back at Elias, "the Marine Corps ensures its veterans are cared for. We were already working to get Staff Sergeant Vance into better housing and ensure his needs are met. That process will now be expedited. But more importantly, we are here today to remind this community who he is. He walks among you not as a burden, but as a blessing, a living piece of history, a reminder of the values this country stands for." He then did something unexpected. He pulled out his wallet and placed a credit card on the counter. "Today and every day that Staff Sergeant Vance chooses to grace this diner with his presence, his meal is on the United States Marine Corps. Consider it a standing order." He looked around the room again, his gaze lingering on the now shaken patrons. "Let this be a lesson," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "that you never know the true story of the person sitting next to you. You never know the battles they've fought, the sacrifices they've made. Treat everyone with the respect and dignity they deserve, not based on their appearance, but on the inherent worth of every human being. And especially, treat those who have served this nation with the honor they have earned." The tension in the room slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a profound sense of humility and introspection. Colonel Mitchell approached the counter again, speaking quietly to Elias now, the formality replaced by a warm, genuine connection. "Elias," he said, "it's good to see you, though I wish it were under different circumstances. I heard you were in this area. We've been trying to track you down." Elias nodded, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "Didn't want to be found, Bobby," he said, using a familiar address that spoke of shared history.
Colonel Mitchell chuckled softly.
"Always the quiet professional, even now. Well, you're found. And you're not alone. We'll make sure you're taken care of." The other Marines, who had remained standing at attention or parade rest throughout the entire address, now relaxed slightly, though their respectful posture remained. A few exchanged quiet, reverent glances towards Elias. Mr. Henderson, still reeling, tentatively approached the counter. "Staff Sergeant Vance," he stammered, his voice choked with emotion. I am so incredibly sorry. I had no idea. Please, accept my sincerest apology. Sarah, she acted on her own, but it happened on my watch. I will make sure this is never forgotten. Your coffee. Your coffee is always on the house. Starting now. Forever. Elias looked at him, his expression unreadable for a moment, then gave another small, weary nod. Apology accepted, Mr. Henderson, he said softly. We all make mistakes. Colonel Mitchell and a few of the senior Marines stayed for a while longer, talking quietly with Elias at the counter, sharing hushed memories, speaking of comrades lost and battles won. The other Marines quietly dispersed throughout the diner, taking seats at tables, ordering breakfast. Their presence wasn't intimidating anymore. It was a comforting, watchful circle of protection and camaraderie around their staff sergeant. The atmosphere in the diner had transformed completely. The earlier indifference was gone, replaced by a palpable sense of respect, awe, and gratitude. The remaining patrons, and those who trickled in later, couldn't help but stare, their curiosity mixed with reverence. Word of the incredible event spread through the small town like wildfire. In the days and weeks that followed, the daily grind became a different place. Mr. Henderson, genuinely contrite and shaken by the incident, made a very public apology, both in the diner and in the local paper, detailing Elias's service and the disrespectful treatment he had received. A framed citation detailing Staff Sergeant Elias Vance's military honors was placed on the wall near the counter, a permanent reminder. Veterans, previously just another part of the community landscape, were now treated with noticeable extra care and appreciation. And Elias Vance? He still came to the daily grind. He still sat at the counter. But he was no longer invisible. People smiled at him, nodded, sometimes even approached him hesitantly to offer a quiet word of thanks for his service. He remained the same quiet, unassuming man, but now, his silence was understood not as emptiness, but as the deep, profound stillness of a man who had seen and done things most could only imagine. The Marine Corps made good on their promise, ensuring Elias was moved into comfortable, safe housing and had access to the health care and support he deserved. Colonel Mitchell visited occasionally, a link to the past that Elias cherished. The incident at the daily grind served as a stark, unforgettable lesson for the entire town. It was a powerful reminder that judgment based on appearance is a dangerous folly, that true worth is often hidden beneath a humble exterior, and that the quiet sacrifices of ordinary heroes deserve not just occasional remembrance, but constant, unwavering respect and gratitude. Elias Vance, the man given discarded scraps from a bin, had, through the intervention of his military family, reminded an entire community of the enduring value of honor, service, and the profound dignity found in a life well lived, no matter how worn the clothes or how slow the step. His quiet strength, his unwavering dignity in the face of disrespect, ultimately became the catalyst for change, a ripple effect of respect spreading outward from that simple diner counter. It's easy to overlook the quiet ones, the ones who don't demand attention, the ones whose stories are etched in the lines on their faces and the scars on their souls rather than shouted from the rooftops. But these are often the people who have given the most, sacrificed the most, carried the heaviest burdens. They are the pillars upon which our communities and our freedoms are built. The story of Staff Sergeant Elias Vance is a testament to the fact that true honor resides within, and that while the world may forget, the bonds forged in service, the respect earned through sacrifice, are unbreakable. Remember to look beyond the surface. Remember to offer a kind word, a helping hand, a simple gesture of respect. You never know whose life you might touch, or whose story you might unknowingly be a part of. And you never know when a quiet act of disrespect might be witnessed by those who will ensure that honor is served. If this story inspired you and reinforced your belief in treating everyone with dignity, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to hear more stories of hidden heroes, unexpected vindication, and the power of respect, make sure to subscribe to my channel. Type honor in the comments to show your support for our veterans and the values Elias Vance represents. Subscribe for more stories that remind you that courage and character are often found in the most unexpected places.